I'm Gleaves Whitney. I'm proud to direct the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies here at Grand Valley State University. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very happy to see all of you after a long summer, although several of you were a little snarky and said, when I said, great, being back this summer, you'd say, what summer? So it was a different summer, wasn't it? I'd like to recognize a couple of people who are very special to these events here at the Hauenstein Center. First of all, I'd like to recognize members of the Hauenstein family who are here in the front row. Ralph D., Carolyn, Brian, thank you so much for being here. I'd also like to recognize President Emeritus Don Lubbers and Nancy Lubbers, First Lady Nancy Lubbers. Thank you so much. Well, a little background on this evening's event. I'm looking at Paul Farr right there, and it was almost exactly 1 year ago. It was Thursday, September 6th, he tells me, that I met Lynne Olson. Dr. Farr and Bridget introduced me to her. She was here in town to give a talk, and I was so impressed with the talk and her insights that I thought, we have got to bring Lynne Olson in for the 80th anniversary, basically, marking the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II. And sure enough, when we inquired about bringing Lynne in, we were very fortunate that she was not overbooked for this week and for this marking of the outbreak, because you can imagine how much she is in demand at this time in particular, because it is such a benchmark 80 years later. So we're fortunate to have booked her, and we are pleased that she is going to be able to offer insights. Why is it so important to the Hauenstein Center to bring in Lynne Olson? Lots of people speak about World War II. And there will be a formal introduction, by the way, about Lynne in just a minute, but I want to set the stage for tonight's presentation. It's important because now that Ralph Hauenstein is no longer with us, I think it is especially important to be able to bring in people who can paint the picture of what it was like to be in London, to be in Paris during the Second World War, people who understand the violence of the events. So many young people in particular have already forgotten or never really learned in depth much about the Second World War. Lynne can recreate, and give our imagination an assist of what it was like to go through that terrible conflict and how it impinged on Ralph Hauenstein's work. He was head of the intelligence branch of the Army under Eisenhower in World War II. He traveled through war-devastated cities. He went through places in the Second World War that had been bombed back to the Stone Age. So his awareness of what that continent went through, the most terrible war in human history, was profound. So anytime I can invite a speaker here who helps us understand how that war came about, how it was prosecuted, the alliances that were needed to make it happen. And Ralph came back from that experience determined to help with the rising generation, teach them leadership lessons, to help, as he said to me once, he said, the alliance that was forged in World War II was forged with great difficulty. And that alliance proved that if you could bring all of those different personalities, some 24 world leaders, to the table and share common goals, if you could bring them together, then we learned a lot about common ground and how to bring it about in a day such as ours when there's so much fractiousness. So I think you just heard the mission of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. This is out of those conversations with Ralph, we're determined to carry on his good legacy and try to foster the insight that's necessary for the common ground and the common good. Most of you have been to Hauenstein Center programs before, and you know that we've reserved a very special time. We have some 70 Leadership Academy candidates, and they are a wonderful group of young people. It's what energizes me. I keep coming back to this job year in, year out because of the candidates, these young people who get Ralph and get the understanding that they're going to be the leaders who tackle some of the seemingly intractable issues that we face today. And today, this evening, I'm really pleased that we have a very special candidate who is going to introduce herself in what we call our Leadership Minute. We have Amanda Hoffman, who's in her third year. Amanda is from the beautiful town up north of Harbor Springs, and she has been with us for 3 years at the Academy, and she already has a great job lined up as an accountant for Plant Moran when she graduates in December. Would you please join me in welcoming Amanda Hoffman to the stage? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. As Cleve said, my name is Amanda Hoffman, and I'm a third-year member of the Cook Leadership Academy. I am currently in my final semester of graduate study, where I'm completing a Master of Science in Accounting. As a business student, I have learned the importance of networking and establishing relationships. This has been reiterated through the Cook Leadership Academy Mentorship Program. As a Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidate, I was paired with a mentor my first semester. My mentor, Mrs. Claudia Badgema, has many years of experience in both the business and academic fields. She was an instrumental part in my decision to pursue a graduate degree. Due to her experience in both business and academia, she understands many of the barriers that I will soon face upon entering a male-dominated profession. Because of this, she has frequently encouraged me to tackle gender barriers within the accounting field and has provided me with tips on how to approach these issues. Extra events offered to CLA fellow candidates, including Econ Club and Hauenstein Center luncheons, have provided me opportunities to be seated at the table with some of Grand Rapids' most influential business and government leaders, such as Mayor Rosalind Bliss. The relationships I have built and the experiences I have had as a Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidate have been integral in my professional development. My name is Amanda, and I am a leader.
Now you know why we're so proud of her, right? Well, now I would like to introduce Jacob Bogart to introduce our special guest this evening. Jacob is a graduate of Grand Valley State University. He was in the Cook Leadership Academy also, so he's a fellow, and he is the person who will be standing here prior to these programs from here on out this year. Jacob, would you please come forward? Give Jacob a welcome.
Good evening, everyone. If you were hoping to see Scott St. Louis this evening, I'm sorry to disappoint. I promise I am just as interesting. As Gleaves mentioned, my name is Jacob Bogart, and tonight it is my privilege to introduce acclaimed historian and best-selling author Lynne Olson. Lynne Olson honed her storytelling abilities at the University of Arizona, and later as a journalist, feature writer, and the first female correspondent for Moscow for the Associated Press. She would later cover national politics and eventually the White House for the Washington Bureau of the Baltimore Sun. Throughout her 8 books, she doesn't simply tell vivid, detailed stories. She recreates the days of World War II. But don't just take my word for it. As 2013 recipient of the Hauenstein Fellowship Award and former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright called Olson our era's foremost chronicler of World War II politics and diplomacy. In her bestseller, Citizens of London, The Americans Who Stood with Britain in Its Darkest, Finest Hour, she tells the story of 3 Americans who shaped the public and President Roosevelt's opinion in helping London in its crucial time of need. In another of her bestsellers, Last Hope Island, Britain, Occupied Europe, and the Brotherhood That Helped Turn the Tide of War, she recounts the role Britain played as a refuge for foreign leaders of occupied nations throughout Europe. Lynne Olson's research goes a step above, bringing to light details others may miss. This evening, she will draw from both Citizens of London and Last Hope Island as she shares her insights on the formation of these crucial alliances that eventually won the war. Let's give a warm West Michigan welcome to our guest this evening, Lynne Olson.
Thank you very, very much. I am really honored and delighted to be here. It was a lovely moment when I met Gleaves last fall, and I remember vividly meeting you, and we had a wonderful conversation, and he said, would you be interested in coming back? And I said, of course. And so here I am, and I am really happy to be here on a number of levels, but one of them is because, frankly, I did not know much about this university before I came. My husband and I have become fairly good friends with Jim Blanchard, the former governor of Michigan, and congressman from here, from Michigan, and he has touted Grand Valley over and over and over again, and so I was thrilled to be able to get given the chance to come here, and everything he said has proven to be true. I've totally enjoyed the visit, and I am very, very impressed with the wonderful work the Hauenstein Center is doing. You should be proud of it, too. In the summer of 1945, World War II came to an end. Next year in August, we will commemorate the 75th anniversary of that event. For the vast majority of people in this country and elsewhere, that is ancient history. The number of American veterans who fought in the war and are still alive has dwindled down to a relative handful. In the 1940s, they were teenagers, and now they're in their 90s or older. I look around this auditorium today, and not many of us here have personal memories of the war. And yet we keep writing about it. I certainly do. In the last 25 plus years, I've written 8 books of history, and 7 of them have focused to a greater or lesser extent on World War II. My main interest has been on the early years of the war, looking at the United States, but even more so at Britain. People ask me all the time why I, as an American, am interested in Britain, and I'll get into that later on, but it was such an incredible time for Britain. In 1940, Britain was the last country in Europe standing against Hitler. And I was talking today, you can't beat this for drama. On May 10th, 1940, Hitler launched his blitzkrieg of Western Europe, invading the Netherlands, Belgium, and eventually France. On that same day, May 10th, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain. I mean, you can't beat that. A country that has that, you keep writing about, and I certainly do. I keep going back to the war in large part because it was such an astonishing, cataclysmic, history-changing series of events that still have not been fully and completely told. But I also think there are lessons to be drawn from it, lessons that are particularly relevant and critically important today. And one of those lessons is embodied in a remark that Winston Churchill made in September 1943. This is what he said: "If we are together, nothing is impossible. If we are divided, all will fail." What he was referring to was the wartime partnership between the United States and Great Britain. That alliance, as you know, has come to be known as the special relationship that helped win the war, preserve democracy, and save the world. As the years have gone by, its creation has seemed almost preordained. First, Churchill rousing his country in the nick of time in 1940 to stand alone against Hitler. And then Franklin Roosevelt and the Americans riding to the rescue of Churchill and the British. In fact, though, it was far from certain until Pearl Harbor that alliance was actually going to happen. And once it did, it was a fragile and tension-filled partnership from the moment of its birth. There were a lot of strains, a lot of tension, a lot of rivalry and prejudices between the two countries, from the top civilian and military leadership down to ordinary citizens. The US and Britain may have shared a common language and heritage, a common love of freedom, but there was a tremendous amount of ignorance and misunderstanding about each other's history and military and political circumstances. The British had a bad habit of condescending to the Americans, treating them like misbehaving colonists rather than independent allies. The Americans, not surprisingly, were very resentful, thinking that the British had not exactly distinguished themselves on the battlefield up to that point. And who were they to tell us how to run the war, especially when we were coming to rescue them? It took a lot of hard work on the part of many people, both British and American, to pull this thing off. And I write about a number of them in my book, Citizens of London. One of them was the American ambassador to London during the war, John Gilbert Wynant. Wynant acted as an interpreter and peacemaker between Roosevelt and Churchill. We have this idea, this is one of the pieces of common wisdom that has come down through the decades, that they were great friends, that they basically single-handedly created this alliance and kept it going. But that is to some extent true. But at times they were great rivals as well, and they needed other people to keep them together. Gil Wynant also worked to alleviate tension and promote cooperation among the two countries' other top military and government figures. In addition, along with General Dwight Eisenhower, the first commander of American forces in Britain, Wynant tried to educate the citizens of the two countries about each other, to smooth away the misunderstandings and stresses that increasingly cropped up as the war approached its climax. From the moment Wynant landed in London, he came to London in March 1941, which was really the worst time of the war for the British. We think, I think it's common wisdom that in fact the Blitz in the Battle of Britain, when the British were being bombed by the Germans, was the worst time of the war, but it really wasn't. It was 1941 when it looked like the German submarines were about to destroy the supply line between Britain and the United States, which meant if that happened that the British would starve. It was a very, very dark time when Gil Wynant arrived on the scene in March 1941. And the first thing he said when he got off the plane from the US was, there is no place I'd rather be than in London, than in England. And that just set the tone for his tenure in Britain. He walked the streets of London during the worst of the Blitz as the bombs were falling, asking people what he could do to help. And he was the first American that gave the British the idea that maybe America did care about them and what happened to them. According to the Times of London, John Gilbert Wynant was the adhesive, the glue that helped to hold the wartime alliance together. And as I said, there were many others like him. He stood out for me, but there were others like him. In a later book called Last Hope Island, I write about another vitally important World War II alliance, this one between Britain and the occupied countries of Europe. Both of these critical wartime partnerships underscore the importance of closing ranks and joining together to fight for what we believe in. It also shows what can happen if we don't. When Churchill made that comment that I mentioned early on, he was speaking from experience. In the years just before the war, there was no closing of ranks and no banding together in Britain or Western Europe or the United States to fight the rise of right-wing extremist parties and leaders like Hitler and Mussolini. As Hitler solidified his power in Germany in the 1930s and then took aim at the rest of the continent, Britain and France, which were then the two most powerful democracies in Europe, stood quietly by and took no action. German troops annexed Austria in 1938, March 1938, and the British and French turned a blind eye. They did so again when Hitler seized the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia, in September 1938, after the Munich Conference. In fact, the French and the British did more than turn a blind eye. They actively participated in Czechoslovakia's dismemberment. Finally, in September 1939, as Gleaves mentioned, we just marked the 80th anniversary of the beginning of World War II. September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and France and Britain were forced to declare war against Germany. But then they did nothing to help the Poles. Meanwhile, the smaller countries of Europe, countries like Norway, Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, were desperately trying to stay out of the war and remain neutral. Why should they get involved? It was a very good question. They looked at the major Western powers, Britain and France, sitting on the sidelines, and the US across the ocean, resolutely isolationist, And you can't blame them for wanting to stay as far away from this war as possible. And then the unthinkable happened. In April 1940, Hitler pounced on Norway and Denmark. And a month later, Nazi troops shocked the world by launching a massive blitzkrieg of Western Europe. In just a little over 4 weeks, Germany conquered Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and then, to everyone's shock, the greatest prize of all, France. France was supposed to have the finest army in Europe, even better than the Germans, but within 3 weeks, they were defeated. By June of 1940, Britain was the last and the only bastion of freedom and democracy left in Europe. The only hope for the British during that desperate time was American aid. But that aid was very, very skimpy and continued to be so until well after Pearl Harbor, which happened just in the nick of time for the British. By December 7th, 1941, Great Britain was holding on only by the skin of its teeth. It was, in fact, very close to being defeated by Germany. Thanks to the Japanese attack on American soil, the U.S. finally entered the war and allied itself with Britain, saving that country and the world from catastrophe. I'd like to talk for a few minutes now about the other wartime alliance I've mentioned, the one between Britain and the countries of occupied Europe. After those nations were defeated by Germany so quickly in 1939 and 1940, many British, believe it or not, were actually quite happy that they stood alone against Hitler. Now, that might not be that hard to understand now when you look at what they're doing with Brexit, but I mean, when you think about it, they were that close to being defeated. But Britain was and is basically an insular country, literally an island separated from the rest of Europe. And for most of its history, it has tried very hard to stay clear of Europe and its entanglements. And that remained true in 1940, even though their own country's future looked impossibly bleak. It's one of the things I really love doing research is looking into this whole subject, and I found a letter from the King of England, George VI, who wrote to his mother, Queen Mary, after France had been defeated, and he says, personally, I feel very happy that we no longer have allies that we have to be nice to and to pamper. What? But their new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was much more of a realist. He knew that whether it wanted allies or not, Britain desperately needed them. Again, remember that the U.S. at this point is still neutral. So to the dismay of many in his government, Churchill flung open Britain's doors to the political leaders and armed forces of 6 occupied European countries: Czechoslovakia, Poland, Norway, Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The self-appointed representative of Free France, General Charles de Gaulle, also found refuge there. In Last Hope Island, I write about the tremendous help that those allies gave Britain, help that most people don't know about, which included troops, money, ships, natural resources from their countries, and desperately needed information about the German military presence in their nations. All these resources helped save Britain from defeat, and in the latter part of the war, proved to be of immense benefit to the overall Allied victory. I talk a lot about this in the book, and I'd like to mention just a couple of examples of what these countries did. One is the Battle of Britain, which was indeed a turning point in the war. The Battle of Britain occurred really in the fall of 1940, the late summer and fall of 1940, when the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, set out to basically crush the RAF and to get rid of all the airfields, to get rid of all the aircraft factories, so that they would have a fighting chance. They planned to invade, Hitler wanted to invade Britain, but they had to destroy the RAF before they could do that. So it was an incredibly critical battle. It was all in the air in the fall of 1940. Well, I grew up as an Anglophile, and I knew a bit about the Battle of Britain. And I thought that only British pilots flew in the Battle of Britain. Wouldn't you think that if you didn't know that much about it? My husband and I were doing research for our first book, and happened to watch, and as part of the research, we happened to watch an old British movie called The Battle of Britain. Some of you may have seen it. It was made in the 60s. It starred a cast of millions. You know, every famous British actor known to man was in this movie. But that wasn't what really interested me. In this movie, there is a scene, a very brief scene, of a squadron of Polish pilots flying in the battle. And it's meant to be kind of funny because the pilots are speaking Polish, and their British controllers on the ground are going crazy because they're not paying attention. The pilots aren't paying attention to them, and they don't know what the pilots are saying. So it's supposed to be, you know, kind of a humorous moment. And I thought, Polish pilots? And that actually led to a book that my husband and I wrote about Poland in World War II. In fact, yes, indeed, there were Polish pilots flying in the Battle of Britain. More than 20% of the pilots who fought in that battle were not from Britain. They were from occupied Europe and countries in the British Commonwealth. And as it turned out, a good percentage of them were Poles, and the Polish pilots made the difference between victory and defeat in the Battle of Britain, something that not many people know. The Poles were also the first to crack the Germans' fiendishly complex Enigma code. Many of you have probably seen the movie Imitation Game. If you saw that movie starring Benedict Cumberbatch, you would think that Bletchley Park and Alan Turing were the only ones responsible for cracking the code. In fact, the Poles had cracked the code in the early 1930s. And just weeks before the war began in September 1939, Polish cryptographers brought British and French spy masters to Poland and turned over to them not only copies of the Enigma machine, but information on how to use it, to use the machine. And as one top English codebreaker said, Bletchley Park could not have done what it did without that information and without that gift of the machine. That provided the foundation upon which Bletchley Park built its stunningly successful ultra code-breaking operation. This list of examples goes on and on. Throughout the war, more than 7,000 Allied servicemen, most of them airmen, most of them air crews who had been shot down over Europe, were smuggled out of occupied Europe and back to Britain by escape lines run by Europeans, most of them young women. Meanwhile, hundreds of European spies passed on to the British a flood of intelligence about German military activity in their countries, including detailed plans of key enemy bases and fortifications. And I dare say Ralph Hauenstein probably was the recipient of many of these messages and these secrets. As Life magazine noted in 1943, practically all the Allied war plans for the invasion of Europe were based on information supplied by European spy networks. Britain also bankrolled a vast network of European resistance groups whose sabotage activities were credited by General Eisenhower with playing, quote, a very considerable part in our final victory. In addition, the occupied countries contributed almost 1 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen to the Allied ranks. European units fighting under British command took part in every major land, sea, and air campaign on the Western Front and were crucial to the victories at Monte Cassino and on other major battlefields. Yet for all the support that the British and Europeans provided each other, their relationship, like the relationship between England and the United States, was not an easy one, to put it mildly. To many exiled Europeans, the British seemed arrogant and insensitive, knowing very little about the world outside their island and failing to understand the ruthlessness of the German occupation. The British, meanwhile, had little patience with the constant feuding, rivalries, and demands of the foreigners crowding their shores. Nonetheless, as the war reached its climax, most of the British and Europeans were able to put aside their differences and, just like the Brits and Americans, work closely together toward their mutual goal winning the war. And it certainly paid off in the end. Thanks to those two partnerships that I've been talking about, as well, of course, as the Soviet Union's crucial participation in the Grand Alliance, the Allies did, in fact, achieve victory. But, and this is really my main point tonight, it's also really important to remember that this cooperation continued after the war. While the fighting was still going on, the European governments in exile in London, for example, began to see the advantage of forming closer bonds with each other. Remember, I talked about them being very separate before the war began. They really didn't have much in contact with each other. They were very scared, actually, to band together because of the fear of Hitler. But while they were in London, they were thrown together in a way that would never have happened in peacetime. Haunted by the disaster that had shattered their countries, European leaders began to explore the idea of gaining greater security and strength for their nations through a possible European Union. As the de facto capital of occupied Europe, London was the perfect breeding ground for cooperation between these leaders, because for 5 years, as I said, they were able to work and socialize together in ways that would never have been possible before the war. And as they did so, they became convinced that their nations must come together if Europe hoped to achieve any kind of future influence and safety. Their cooperation in London planted the seeds for the campaign for European unification that followed World War II, which is really ironic considering what's going on today in Britain. One historian later wrote, "If the European community is compared to a house, those years of cooperative exile in wartime London are part of the foundation." But even as they launched their drive for European integration, the leaders of the movement were anxious to retain their close ties to Britain. Indeed, they wanted Britain and Churchill. Britain and Churchill had given them refuge at a time they needed it most, and they wanted Britain and Churchill to take the lead in creating a unified Europe, a fact that no one talks about these days. At first, there seemed to be plenty of grounds for optimism. Churchill had been a long-time advocate of what he called a United States of Europe. He saw it as kind of a forerunner of today's European Union, which he hoped would end the existence of separate tariffs, passports, and currencies, and allow the free interchange of people, goods, and services. However, it soon became obvious that for all his eloquence, Churchill was not willing to do anything concrete to make European Union a reality. And furthermore, that he and the British had no interest in becoming an integral part of Europe themselves. As the German Chancellor Willy Brandt later noted, Britain was reluctant to, quote, renounce the insularity of its past greatness. In Churchill's view, Britain's post-war identity lay in its empire and in a close relationship, a close alliance with the United States. In effect, he and Britain were refusing to accept the fact that the country's days as a world power were over. It still clung to the memory of its days as one of the big three in World War II, and couldn't bear the thought of surrendering any part of its national sovereignty. Whatever the reasons for Britain's standoffishness, European leaders finally had had enough. Realizing that Britain would never take the lead in the unification movement, they assumed the initiative themselves, taking a series of steps that ended in 1958 with the creation of the European Economic Community, also called the Common Market. When the EEC began accepting new members, Britain declined the invitation. A few years later, the British began having second thoughts. The Common Market actually had turned out to be an incredible economic success, while Britain was suffering from a weak economy and a dissolving empire. In addition, their special relationship with the United States had not evolved into the close-knit, equal partnership that they had sought. So very reluctantly, Britain in 1973 did finally become a member of the European community, which later became the European Union. But as we know from bitter recent experience, including today, many people in Britain never fully reconciled themselves to the idea that their country was part of Europe. Their uneasiness about those ties increased as Europe's economic success story faded. And now, thanks to Brexit, their history has returned to haunt them, causing extraordinary problems and challenges, not only for them, but for a very fragile Europe and the rest of the world. But it's important to remember in the midst of this one key fact. In its efforts toward unification, Western Europe took an enormous step away from centuries of nationalism, ruinous nationalism. There is no question that there are many problems today with the European Union. But there is also no question that the campaign for European unification was an extraordinary effort that helped lead to more than half a century of peace and prosperity for Western Europe. After the war, leaders in the United States also understood the importance of international cooperation and communal responsibility to make sure that the horror of World War would never happen again. Because the war was so fresh in their memory, many Americans in the late 1940s were fully aware of how calamitous a breakdown of world order could be. And they were constantly reminded by the Cold War and the looming Soviet threat that international stability and peace could not be taken for granted. And so over a period of decades, the United States also undertook unprecedented efforts to ensure that the world order did not collapse once again. During this time, American leaders, both Democrats and Republicans, Arthur Vandenberg and Gerald Ford being prominent among them, consciously rejected the isolationist attitudes that had prevailed in the 1930s. After the searing experience of World War II, they concluded that the failure to stand up for friendly nations in the face of external aggression, the failure to speak up on behalf of democratic values under assault, the failure to prevent trade wars caused by protectionism, and the failure to support international organizations by withdrawing American support had produced a world with a leadership vacuum and an invitation to chaos. To make sure that would never happen again, U.S. leaders embraced partnerships with the rest of the world, becoming involved in a global network of security alliances like NATO, and participating in the UN and a number of other multilateral institutions. For the first time in its history, the United States had agreed to become a permanent force in keeping the peace in Europe. And as it has turned out, NATO has been overall a huge success. It not only has helped keep the peace in Europe, it has also had a major impact beyond that region. Indeed, it has served as an anchor for world security and order for the past 7 decades. American leaders also promoted, on an international level, concepts like free trade, democracy and human rights, and respect for the rule of law. The result was a US-sponsored post-war international system that was never perfect, God knows, but it was still a system in which global and American prosperity reached dizzying heights. Until recently, we have tended to think of a total collapse of global order as something that cannot happen in our time, that it's a relic of a bygone era. But that's not the way history works. Such breakdowns have long been the norm rather than the exception in international affairs. We seem to have forgotten, as have the British with this whole protracted struggle over Brexit, that global norms and stability are not self-sustaining, but rather demand constant support and maintenance by countries like ours that created these norms in the first place. There's no question that many Americans have grown tired of bearing the burdens of international leadership. It's an understandable attitude, but it reveals a lack of historical knowledge of why that leadership is worth bearing. Why do we have troops and military hardware stationed around the globe? Why do we have an extensive system of alliances all over? Why do we worry so much about what happens in faraway places? The answer to these questions is the same: to avoid the kind of worldwide catastrophe that ended up killing tens of millions of people beginning 80 years ago this week. The writer George Santayana once wrote, "Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it." And that's the threat facing us today. Our amnesia about the past is coinciding with a time of incredible international danger. In Eastern Europe and elsewhere, authoritarian governments are coercing their people and nibbling away at the international order. Chinese leaders are laying plans for an Asia dominated by China, and Russian leaders are talking about the transition to a post-Western world. In the Middle East, Iran is asserting its regional ambitions. The president of Syria is perpetrating a slow-motion genocide, and the Islamic State and other jihadi groups continue to wreak havoc, even as their military fortunes decline. North Korea, meanwhile, is racing ahead with its nuclear and missile programs in defiance of the international community. These threats are diverse, but they do share a common theme. They represent the warning lights flashing on a car dashboard. They are indications that an international system that has long been so historically exceptional in its effectiveness and stability is now unraveling. This is not an optimistic picture, I know, that I'm painting. There's no question about that. But at the same time, I'm personally an optimist. I always have been. And just as I go back in history to see the dangers, I also see what people, ordinary people, can do if they raise their voices, if they band together to influence their governments and make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. And we have seen it today. I don't know, as you can tell, I'm an Anglophile, and I follow what's going on in Britain very carefully. Today in Britain was a historic debate in Parliament. I think it equaled, it doesn't, maybe not equals, but it comes close to the historic debate over that basically forced Neville Chamberlain from power in 1940. Today, a small group of conservative Tory rebels basically stood up against their prime minister who was trying to subvert democracy. There's no question that's what Boris Johnson is trying to do by suspending Parliament. They stood up to him in a debate and said, "We will not go along." And they voted against him, and he lost the vote. It's a very complex issue, but basically, they refused to do it, and I think he's really on the ropes. They showed moral courage. They're basically losing their jobs. He and his government are taking away the whip, which means that there will be a new election probably in the next few weeks. They will not be allowed to run as Tories in the next election because they dared to defy him. But knowing that, they stood up and showed moral courage and voted against him. And that's the kind of what I'm talking about, with people standing up and banding together to do what's right. I've also been buoyed. I found some hope when I was working on my latest book, which was just published a few months ago. It's called Madame Cod's Secret War. And it's about the French resistance during the war, particularly about a young French woman named Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, who headed the largest and most influential intelligence network in occupied France. Throughout the war, this network, called Alliance, supplied the British and American high commands with vital German military secrets, including information about troop movements, submarine sailing schedules, fortifications, and coastal gun emplacements, especially on the D-Day coast, on the coast that the troops landed on D-Day, as well as the Reich's new terror weapons, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket. These were not professional spies. There were more than 3,000 of them. Most of them were ordinary people like government clerks, military officers, shopkeepers, fishermen, housewives, doctors, artists, plumbers, students, bus drivers. The list goes on and on. But they made an enormous contribution to the Allied effort. In the words of one historian, the agents of Alliance, through their work and sacrifice, saved thousands of Allied lives, and speeded up the victory over Hitler. I'd like to end by reading the last few sentences of the book. These ordinary men and women never planned to become heroes, but they were. Although they were from varied walks of life and political backgrounds, a moral common denominator overrode all their differences. A refusal to be silenced and an iron determination to fight against the destruction of freedom and human dignity. In doing so, they, along with other members of the resistance, saved the soul and honor of France. Equally important, they served as an example from the past of what ordinary people can do in the present and future when faced with existential threats to their country, to the world, and to basic human rights. As one female agent of the network noted many years after the war, resistance is a state of mind. We can exercise it at any moment. Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's been said that Hitler's biggest mistake during the war was declaring war on the U.S. after Pearl Harbor because it turned a one-front war into a two-front war. If Hitler had not declared war after Pearl Harbor, would the U.S. have been involved in Europe?
That's a really good what-if question. And the answer is, I don't know what the answer is really, but I think that we definitely would have gotten involved at some point against Germany. The question in my mind is, would we have gotten involved fast enough to save Britain?
Too late, yeah.
Because Britain would have been involved in a two-front war at that point. And if we had just gone after Japan, I think the chances are very likely that Britain would have fallen.
Thank you.
During Hitler's rise to power, when do you think the point of no return was for countries in Europe, like France and like Britain, to be able to stop his ascent?
That's a really good question. Also a really good question. I think he could have been stopped. He could have been stopped when he invaded Poland, because everything he did up to that point was a dare. I mean, he wasn't strong enough. The German forces weren't strong enough if in fact France and Britain had the will to actually fight. But Hitler was he understood what was going on in Britain and France, especially among the leaders, that they were doing, and it was clear they were trying to do everything they could to conciliate him, to appease him. The easiest time to have stopped him was when German troops went into the Rhineland in 1936. That was his first major violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The Rhineland had been part of Germany, but it had been declared a kind of a neutral buffer zone between France and Germany, and the Germans were kicked out. I mean, German military were kicked out. Troops, it was a very small number of troops that moved in. He had nobody. He did not have the troops to back up. If the French had gone in and said, "Get out," he would have had to get out, and that probably would have been the end of him. But every single time he made a move, from then on, the French and the British just threw up their hands and say, "Okay, you're being a naughty boy, and you better not do it again." And he would say, "Okay, I'm not going to do it again," and then he would do it again 6 months later, and finally they realized that naughty boy was this madman that was intent on taking over Europe, and they had to declare war in September 1939.
Thank you.
Yeah, it would actually be helpful, I think, to take microphones around to people rather than make them. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I was interested when you talked about members of the RAF or foreign flyers that came over, and I understand there were some Americans also that came over.
Yes.
So were there consequences for some of those flyers that got involved in a war that their country was not involved in?
Yeah, and only the Americans faced those consequences, because the other foreigners who flew with the RAF, their countries were at war against, because the countries of the Commonwealth were automatically at war, or declared war right after Britain did. But yes, the Americans actually were threatened with the loss of their citizenship. And a number of them actually were, their citizenship was taken away from them. That obviously didn't last long once we got into the war. They were, but yeah, it was against the law to do what they did, against American law to do what they did. So they were breaking American law to come over and fight. But I think there were about 7 or 8 in the Battle of Britain, but there were hundreds flying with the RAF, hundreds of Americans flying with the RAF by the time of Pearl Harbor. They had their own squadrons called the Eagle Squadrons, and they're, not surprisingly, very popular in England.
I'm also interested, I haven't had a chance to read your book about the Women's Spy Network, but that must have been a fascinating amount of research. And there's been other books recently that have touched on that subject also. So
yeah, there have been a spate of books about women spies in World War II. Mine is one of them. Mine is really the only one about, the others have focused on Americans and British women. This is the only one that has, but she's a fascinating woman. She was the only woman to head a major resistance organization in France, and she was basically forgotten by the French. I mean, one of the things that really stood out for me is that de Gaulle and the Free French created this organization called the Order of Liberation, which was kind of the elite, the people that they saw as the elite fighters, the people who contributed most to the liberation of France. And the number at the end of the war was 1,038. And of that number, 1,038, 1,032 were men, 6 were women. And Marie Madeleine for Cod was not one of those 6. So it shows the kind of the world we talked about. Somebody mentioned the male-dominated world. I mean, this was a very male-dominated world, and she was doing something quite extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks.
Which of the 2 political parties during the 30s were primarily supporting isolationism?
You mean in this country? The Republican Party was heavily isolationist, but there was a lot of isolationism within the Democratic Party too. But it was, if you were to ask me which one was more isolationist, it would be the Republican Party. But at the same time, the Republican Party had an element of a strong branch of the Republican Party were internationalists. And they were mostly people who were on the East Coast and West Coast. You know, it was very much a kind of coastal thing. Not surprisingly, because the East Coast had much more interrelationships with Britain and Europe than people in the Midwest. So there were a number of very well-known senators, et cetera, who were internationalists, but for the most part, the Republicans were.
It took Pearl Harbor.
It took Pearl Harbor. But the interesting thing about it is, I mean, we think of this country as strongly isolationist, which it was, but there was a gradual shift in public opinion from actually the fight that Britain put up against Germany started affecting public opinion. You know, when the British were being bombed, and correspondents like Edward R. Murrow, American correspondents, were broadcasting and writing about the bravery and the resolution and the courage of Winston Churchill and the British people. That started changing people's minds.
FDR, from what I've read, wanted to become involved more and more long before Pearl Harbor.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's more complex than that. He certainly wanted Britain to survive. But I really do think that until the day of Pearl Harbor, he hoped that we would not get in the war with boots on the ground in Europe. He was perfectly willing to have the Navy participate, which it was even before Pearl Harbor, and the Air Force. But he really didn't want to have to send American boys over there. And Pearl Harbor obviously changed that.
I understand there was a faction in the British government in 1940 and 41 that really wanted to try to make a deal with Hitler.
Right.
And could you comment on how strong that was and how that worked out?
Well, it worked out well because they didn't. You're absolutely right. There was, within the Tory party, Chamberlain, of course, was desperate to make a deal, really until he was forced out. Even though he was really pressured into declaring war against Germany, throughout the so-called phony war, the 8 months that followed the declaration of war against Germany, in which there was no fighting. I mean, as I said, Britain and France didn't go to Poland's aid. They didn't fight against Germany. So they were hoping they had imposed an economic blockade, and they hoped that that would help bring Germany to its knees, which of course it did not do. So throughout, he was looking to negotiate with Hitler, or hoping to negotiate with Hitler. And many members of his government were as well. And so when Churchill took over in May 1940, those elements of that government were still there. I mean, the British Foreign Secretary, just a couple of weeks after Churchill took over, said basically, why don't we think about using Mussolini as an intermediary so that we can negotiate with Hitler and come to some sort of agreement? And this is one of Churchill's finest hours. If you've seen the movie Darkest Hour, that's what this was all about him finally getting up and saying, no, we will not do that. We will not surrender. I mean, we will not negotiate. And then everybody eventually fell in line. I think what's really important to realize, as that movie pointed out, that Churchill, we look back at Churchill quite rightly as being, in a way, the savior of Britain and of Western civilization to some degree, because if he had not done what he did, I really do believe Britain probably would have negotiated. It just looks so overwhelmingly bad for Britain. But Churchill rallied the British people, and they joined with him. But he was not popular when he became. He was really an outsider in the Tory party, and he was not popular with the rank and file of the Tories. So it took him many months before it was so clear that he was the man of the hour. He was the only person in that government that could have done what he did and keep Britain afloat. But it took a while for him to do that. So it was dicey. I mean, he did not come to office and say, those wonderful speeches he gave in which he was full of fire and determination and resistance. Sometimes in the privacy of his office, he didn't feel that way. But he managed to struggle through and persist.
You spoke a lot about isolationism, and that almost being like the downfall of the Western countries. And I'm just curious, as a historian, do you feel that there's a period in time in which we were too involved in international relations, or was that isolationist response that we took during World War II at first, was that in response to something that had happened in the past?
Well, the U.S. has basically, in a sense, early on been an isolationist country. It was founded by people who were getting away from Europe, getting away from the persecution in Europe, getting away from the constant wars in Europe, and so that was deeply embedded in our psyche and our DNA in this country. So you can understand, and again, we are in such a privileged position in this country with two oceans on either side of us protecting us. We don't have people on our, despite what some people say, we don't have people on our borders who are trying to overthrow this country, trying to take over this country. And so we have a totally different outlook than most of the world does. And so there was, and you can understand, a very strong feeling that we formed this country to get away from what was going on over there. Why should we get involved again? But it's kind of difficult not to get involved when you become the greatest economic power, which we already were before World War II. You know, to say, okay, we're going to be the greatest economic power and not get involved in the rest, you know, you can't do that. You really can't. And besides, the world was getting smaller and smaller. You know, we had airplanes, we had submarines, we had ways of getting to places that we didn't have before. So it was a real test of this country, that debate about whether or not to get involved in the war and the role of this country. And you know, I'm not sure what would have happened if we hadn't if we hadn't had Pearl Harbor. Something like that would have happened. But it was a great, that year and a half of debate was a really great way of airing you know, the pros and the cons of getting involved. And as I said before, it didn't, when Pearl Harbor happened, it didn't change an isolationist country into an interventionist country overnight. That had been growing, that had been building, that people were changing their minds. And by the time, I think, of Pearl Harbor, even though the majority of people did not want to go to war, I mean, no sane person would want to go to war, but they were willing if, under certain circumstances, if our liberty were at risk. And they also said if Britain were about to go down, basically the polls showed that if Britain were on the brink of defeat, then people thought that we should go to war against Germany. But so the answer to your question is no, this is not new. It's been, you know, part of, as I said, our DNA since this country's beginning.
Thank you.
Over here. Good evening.
Hi.
Could you reveal more of the story regarding the Polish involvement in revealing the secrets of the Enigma machine in terms of what we know about Alan Turing?
Sure. As I said, the Poles were the first ones it's a long story how they became to be the first ones. The Poles Poland has been between is basically between a rock and a hard place all its history, the rock being Germany, the hard place being the Soviet Union, the Russia. I mean, Poland is this country that is in the middle of enemies. It's located in the middle of enemies. And so from all of its history, it has been either invaded or it's invaded them, but it's always been buffeted by these countries, these larger countries around them. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, Poland actually ceased to exist because Prussia, you know, what became Germany, and Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire took parts of Poland and incorporated those parts into their own country. So Poland, which had been, you know, a very, very important country for centuries, was not a country for about 125 years. It became independent again. It became a nation again after World War I, thanks to Woodrow Wilson, and from the beginning of its independence, it set out to create the best intelligence organization it could because it needed to. It needed to spy on its enemies that were made it clear that they wanted to take over Poland again. So it had built up an incredibly strong intelligence organization. And part of that intelligence organization was cryptography. And so young cryptographers from Poland cracked the Enigma code in the early 1930s. Poland is not a large nation, it was not a rich nation, and so it didn't have the resources to develop as much as it could. And then when it became very clear, that Poland was about to be invaded. That's when they invited the French and British codebreakers into Poland and gave them this priceless gift. And the Brits took it back and then hired a bunch of by the way, the Polish codebreakers were mathematicians for the most part. The British codebreakers were like professors of ancient languages and, you know, people that could solve puzzles but really weren't experts, weren't professionals. And as a result of their exposure to the Polish codebreakers, the British started hiring mathematicians, one of them being Alan Turing, who took what they had been given, as did the other British codebreakers, and ran with it. I mean, they were the ones who really turned Bletchley Park into this extraordinary code-breaking operation. But my point is that they couldn't have done it. They probably could not have done it without the Poles to begin with. And the Poles never got the recognition that they deserved for it.
Hi.
Hi.
My question might be a little esoteric.
That's okay.
But I'm aware that American artist Ellsworth Kelly participated in the war effort by creating images on fabric of tanks and military paraphernalia that would imply a presence. Do you know of perhaps European artists in the arena who may have done the same? And if so, how effective might this have been?
You mean as camouflage?
Yeah.
An artist? Yeah, actually, I didn't know about him. But the British, in their, they were, part of the success of D-Day was because the British managed to persuade the Germans that there was this great army that was being built up to invade France at Pas de Calais. It was going to be led by George Patton. And so they made a whole bunch of artificial everything, and including painting large canvases that from the air looked like airfields, etc. And it was an extraordinary effort that actually worked. One of the reasons that the D-Day troops were able to, they suffered a lot of casualties, but were able to succeed is because the Germans kept a lot of their forces back, believing that the main part of the invasion was going to come to Pas de Calais. And of course, George Patton got into the European theater, but he did not lead, he did not lead an army on D-Day. He was still the head of this phantom army at that time.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for coming out. I really appreciate listening to you. I had a question regarding what people would have called Anglophobia during the war from like mainland Europe, specifically from France. I was wondering if maybe that little point of contention between the British and maybe France kind of prevented them from standing up to Germany during the initial phases of them kind of invading other countries before the war and leading up to it.
Are you talking about Anglophobia in France? Is that what?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it went both ways. When I was talking about, I talked about, in particular, about two alliances with Britain and the U.S. and then Britain and the occupied countries of Europe, that there was another alliance. There were many other alliances, but the alliance between France and Britain before the war and then during the time of the war until France was defeated, there was a lot of Anglophobia on the part of the French, and there was a large part of Francophobia on the part of the Brits. That was not a good alliance. It never was a really true partnership because they basically, for many reasons, they did not get along with each other. Neither of them thought that the other was doing as much as they could. Certainly the British weren't. The British had a very tiny army in France during the invasion of France, very, very tiny, so that they played almost no role in the defense of France. And obviously that was a point of great contention on the part of the French. The French military high command was horrendous. They were totally incompetent. So it was just a total mess, that alliance. And it was culminated when the British left, retreated at Dunkirk. And they started the departure, this mass departure, without telling the French that they were going to do it. And in the end, Churchill told the British commanders in France to rescue French troops too, but that wasn't the main point of that rescue. It was to rescue British troops. So, and the effects, the after effects of that difficulty, to put it mildly, still resonate today. There is still a lot of antagonism on the part of both the French and the British about what happened during that time.
Thank you.
One more question?
It's not really a question. I've been feeling very emotional through all of this, all of your presentation, because my parents lived in the Netherlands during the war. I was born right after the war, but I'm just amazed by all this history, all that was going on that you know that happened all around the world. And they were in a small town, and all they knew was there were German boots on the ground. And I just wish that they, maybe I don't know what I wish, but I do know that I want to honor them. I want to honor my father, who was in a German prison camp in Wilhelmshaven. He came back very, very thin and very, very ill, and witnessed many deaths around him, though it was a labor camp, not an extermination camp. And my uncle, who worked for the resistance in the Netherlands and gave his life for the cause. And Bill's father, who came from the United States to help save Europe. And our children would, when they had a history unit in school, they would write an essay about how one grandpa saved the other. And all that is just making my heart full right now. So thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome, but thank you. I mean, those are the kinds of stories that we should be talking about now and remember. I mean, that is what we are trying to prevent. I mean, right. What your parents went through, what the Dutch went through. I didn't talk about it, but my book, Last Hope Island, I go into great detail about the Dutch went through hell. I mean, they went through hell unlike most of Europe. I won't go in because we don't have time. But, you know, this wonderful, prosperous little country, it was so horrendous, I can't tell you. And you know, most people don't know that. People should know that. They should definitely know that.
And I wanted the story not to be lost, so I didn't ask enough questions when my father was alive, because somehow we need to be mature to be able to even be able to think of the questions. So I went to the Netherlands and interviewed my other uncle, and he told the story. And he said, I said, where will you begin? And he said, I will begin in 1939 when I heard Hitler on the radio. So it took a couple of hours to interview him in my native language, and then subtitled it in English. So I feel very grateful that my children can hear that story.
And I wish other children had heard that story too. Thank you.
Thank you.